It was a sunny Tuesday afternoon, around 3:30 p.m. on April 14th, when something happened that would change the small town of Hopeville forever. The normally peaceful streets were bustling with their usual hum, with people enjoying the warmth and the occasional gust of spring wind. Everyone was going about their day, when suddenly the sound of raised voices from inside the local supermarket interrupted the calm. Inside the store, Morgan Freeman, the beloved actor and one of the most respected figures in Hollywood, stood at the self-checkout counter. No one expected to see him here. But then again, why shouldn't he be? After all, even famous stars need groceries, right? What no one could have predicted was what would happen next. As Morgan scanned his items, some fruits, a loaf of bread, and a bottle of water, everything seemed normal. Until the cashier, a young woman named Jessica Turner, leaned forward across the counter, a smug look on her face. "You're just an old fool, aren't you?" she said loud enough for everyone in line to hear. The room went dead silent. The shocking words hung in the air like a bad smell, making everyone turn toward the counter in disbelief. People stared at Jessica, trying to understand what had just come out of her mouth. The crowd held its breath, and for a moment, it seemed as though the world had stopped. Morgan Freeman, ever the composed individual, stood there for a split second. The usually gentle and serene expression on his face shifted just slightly, like a wrinkle on a calm sea, as he processed what had just been said. But there was no visible anger, no outburst. Everyone was waiting for him to respond, to react, to do something, but as the tension built, he simply looked at her with calm, unwavering eyes. Cashier calls Morgan Freeman an old fool. The shocking ending left the whole town speechless. Jessica stood there, her hands still resting on the counter, as if she hadn't just dropped a bombshell in front of the entire store. People exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to proceed. Was she joking? Was it some kind of twisted prank? But no one was laughing. "Excuse me?" Morgan finally said, his voice measured and calm, though there was an edge to it that made everyone freeze. He didn't raise his voice, but there was a weight in his words. "Did you just call me that?" The entire store seemed to hold its breath, the atmosphere thick with the kind of tension that only a moment like this could create. People shifted awkwardly in line, unsure of how to navigate this awkwardness. Some started to back away from the counter, while others grabbed their phones to start recording the scene. Jessica's face went pale. She hadn't expected him to respond like this. She thought he would either laugh it off or get embarrassed. After all, he's just an old man, right? But no, Morgan Freeman wasn't backing down. He wasn't even angry. He was simply waiting. I didn't mean it like that," Jessica stammered, her bravado crumbling. She quickly looked around at the customers who were now staring at her, as if she suddenly realized how much trouble she was in. The murmurs around her grew louder, with some customers beginning to voice their disapproval. "You didn't mean it like what?" Morgan's voice was quieter now, but still firm, each word laced with a quiet power that demanded respect. I was just joking," Jessica said, her eyes darting nervously between the actor and the customers around her. "You know, I didn't mean anything by it." The crowd was still watching, captivated by this bizarre interaction between an actress-turned-legend and a young woman who clearly didn't know the depth of the person standing in front of her. Jessica's palms were sweating, and she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The room felt smaller now, and she knew that she had crossed a line she couldn't take back. The joke was no longer funny, but what came next would leave everyone, including Morgan Freeman, in complete shock. Just when the tension reached its peak, a loud voice cut through the silence from the back of the store. "Is everything okay here?" The voice belonged to Dale Matthews, the store manager. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man who had worked at Hopeville Market for nearly 2 decades. His presence commanded attention, and when he arrived at the counter, everyone fell silent again, waiting for the next move. "Jessica, what's going on?" Dale asked, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene before him. Jessica stood frozen, unsure of how to explain herself. The manager, who had known her since she was a teenager, looked at her with a mix of disbelief and disappointment. "Morgan Freeman," she muttered weakly. "He's here, and I just said something dumb." Dale's gaze flicked to Morgan, and he immediately recognized the iconic actor. The realization of what had just happened seemed to hit him like a freight train. "Well, I think we all need to take a step back here," Dale said, his tone calm but firm. He turned to the other customers in the store. "I'm going to handle this." But there was no stopping what had already started. The energy in the room was shifting. People were whispering to each other, recording the incident, their eyes glued to the drama unfolding before them. Morgan Freeman stood there, his expression unreadable. He didn't seem angry, but there was a weight to his silence. And with every second that passed, the tension in the store built to a crescendo, leaving everyone wondering what would happen next. Would Morgan Freeman retaliate? Would the manager fire Jessica? Or was something far more unexpected about to unfold? The minutes that followed felt like hours. The room remained silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator section in the corner. Jessica stood behind the counter, her eyes darting back and forth between Dale, Morgan, and the people in line. A bead of sweat slid down her temple, her usual cocky attitude evaporating like mist in the early morning sun. Dale stood there, his arms folded across his chest, watching Jessica as if weighing his options. The customers in the store had grown restless. Some shifted from foot to foot, their eyes still locked on the scene. Others exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to speak up or remain silent. Morgan Freeman, however, remained unmoved, his expression as calm as ever. He didn't look angry. He didn't look hurt either. But there was a kind of quiet dignity in the way he stood there waiting. He hadn't moved an inch since he had asked Jessica to clarify her words. It was as if he was giving her space to either come to terms with what she had said or face the consequences of her actions. Dale's gaze finally softened, and he turned to Morgan, his voice low but sincere. "I'm so sorry about this," he said, his tone apologetic. "Jessica has always been, well, she's had a bit of a temper. She didn't mean any harm." Morgan nodded slowly, not taking his eyes off Jessica. "I'm sure she didn't. But words have power, Dale. They always do. And you can't just brush this off." Dale sighed, his posture sagging slightly. He knew that Morgan was right. This wasn't something that could be swept under the rug. He glanced at Jessica, who was now biting her lip, her hands gripping the counter so tightly that her knuckles were turning white. Jessica opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She could feel the weight of the entire store's gaze on her, and for the first time, she realized the gravity of her actions. She had always thought of herself as tough, sarcastic, a person who could handle anything. But facing the wrath of an entire town and the wrath of a man like Morgan Freeman was a different thing entirely. I didn't mean it like that," she finally muttered, her voice shaking. "It was a stupid comment and I'm sorry. Really, I am. I just didn't think." Morgan Freeman took a step closer, his eyes meeting hers. "Thinking before speaking, especially when it comes to people, is something we all have to learn. What you said wasn't just disrespectful. It was hurtful." Jessica nodded, her face reddening. She opened her mouth to apologize again, but this time, Dale cut her off. "You're right," Dale said, his voice gaining strength. "Jessica, you owe Mr. Freeman an apology. This is not how we treat people, especially in this store." For a moment, the air felt thick with tension as Jessica turned back to Morgan, her shoulders slumping in defeat. The weight of the moment was heavy, and she knew she couldn't hide behind her bravado any longer. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice quieter now, filled with genuine regret. "I should never have said that. It was wrong, and I'm sorry for disrespecting you, Mr. Freeman." There was a long pause as Morgan stood still, looking at her. The crowd watched intently, waiting for his response. The whole town seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Morgan spoke, his voice low and steady. "Apology accepted." The tension in the store seemed to lift ever so slightly, as if a small weight had been taken off everyone's shoulders. But the atmosphere was far from normal. The customers who had been whispering and recording now looked around, unsure of what to do. Should they applaud? Should they turn the incident into a viral moment? Morgan Freeman, ever the master of poise, simply nodded and began to gather his groceries. The silence stretched on for a few more moments as he calmly placed his items into the reusable shopping bag, his movements deliberate, each one a reminder of the unshakable calm that had seen him through years of fame, controversy, and public scrutiny. But just as the store seemed to return to its normal rhythm, a voice from the back of the store interrupted the fragile peace. "Hey, is that Morgan Freeman?" It was a woman's voice, loud and clearly excited. People started turning their heads to see who it was, and suddenly there was a shift in the room. The quiet was broken by a few murmurs of recognition. "Oh my God, it is him!" A group of teenage girls had appeared, phones in hand, their eyes wide with disbelief. They were starstruck, and it was clear they hadn't even noticed the earlier confrontation. One of the girls, a blonde with a bright smile, rushed toward Morgan with her phone outstretched. "Can we get a picture with you?" she asked, almost breathless. Morgan looked up from his bag, his face softening into a smile. "Sure," he said, his tone kind but weary. The girls squealed, delighted that they were about to get a selfie with one of Hollywood's most iconic actors. They posed with him, their phones snapping away in rapid succession, the whole store now watching the spectacle unfold. But then, without warning, the tension that had started to dissolve came flooding back. One of the girls, the one closest to Morgan, looked at him for a moment and then, out of nowhere, asked, "Do you think you'll ever do another movie? I mean, you're pretty old. How much longer can you act?" Morgan froze for a second, and for the briefest of moments, the store went dead silent once again. Everyone in the room watched as Morgan Freeman slowly turned to face the girl, his eyes steady but piercing. And then he said something that would shock everyone to the core. "Age doesn't define what I can do. But your disrespect, that's something you should think about." The whole store seemed to hold its breath once more. The girl's smile faltered, and the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Morgan Freeman's response wasn't just a retort, it was a lesson, and it left the entire store speechless. But would that be the last word on this incident? Or was the real drama about to unfold? The store, which had been buzzing with excitement only moments ago, now felt like a pressure cooker on the verge of blowing. The air was thick with anticipation, the earlier awkward silence now giving way to nervous energy. The teenage girl who had dared to question Morgan Freeman stood frozen, her phone still in her hand, the words she had just spoken hanging in the air like an unwanted cloud. Morgan Freeman's words had cut deep, and she wasn't the only one who felt the sting. The entire store was now caught in an uncomfortable stillness, as if everyone was waiting for the fallout. Would she apologize? Would the others step in and make this whole situation even worse? For a moment, it seemed as though nothing would happen. The girl stood still, her eyes wide with shock, unsure of how to respond. Morgan Freeman, however, wasn't waiting around. He had said what needed to be said, and now he was ready to leave. He turned to the counter, casually picking up his bag of groceries and preparing to head to the door. The crowd seemed to part, like a sea of people slowly moving aside as he made his way toward the exit. His calm demeanor was the perfect mask for the storm that had just passed, but there was no denying the weight of what had happened. But before he could leave the store, a voice shouted from behind him. "Wait!" It was Jessica, the cashier, the one who had started this whole mess. Her voice was shaking, but it was louder than the others. She had been watching the entire scene unfold, and now she could no longer stay silent. Morgan turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "Yes, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to cause all of this." Jessica's voice was almost pleading, but she wasn't just apologizing for her words. She was apologizing for the ripple effect that had followed them. She realized now that this wasn't just a slip of the tongue or a stupid comment. It had exposed something deeper, something far more troubling. The crowd had grown quieter once again, and everyone's eyes were fixed on Morgan, waiting to see if he would acknowledge Jessica's apology. Would he forgive her, or would this be the moment that pushed everything too far? Morgan Freeman paused for a long moment, and then he did something that no one expected. He walked back toward the counter and stood directly in front of Jessica. "I know you didn't mean it," he said softly, his voice still calm, but with a tinge of wisdom that only someone who had lived through a lifetime of experiences could carry. "But sometimes, it's the things we don't mean that have the most impact." Jessica nodded, her eyes welling with tears. I understand now, she whispered. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. People in the store, customers who had been watching, stood motionless. Even the group of teenagers who had been snapping selfies with Morgan Freeman now lowered their phones, sensing the gravity of the moment. Just as things seemed to calm down, a voice from the back of the store spoke up. It was a man, probably in his late 30s, dressed in a suit. He had been watching the exchange from afar, but now he couldn't hold back anymore. Are we really going to let her off that easily? He asked, his tone loud and defiant. She insulted him in front of all of us. And now you want to just sweep it under the rug? The man's voice cut through the air like a knife. It was sharp, and it seemed to reignite the tension in the store. Suddenly, all eyes were on him. Jessica's face flushed red, and Morgan Freeman, though still calm, raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Excuse me?" Jessica stammered, trying to regain some of her earlier confidence. "I already apologized. What more do you want from me?" The man, whose name turned out to be Greg Miller, was a local businessman who had been in the store when the incident occurred. He was known around town for being outspoken and, often, controversial. "I want her to understand the damage she caused," Greg continued, his voice rising. "We can't just brush this off. We can't let people think it's okay to insult someone like Morgan Freeman just because they don't like him." Morgan Freeman, who had been quiet during the exchange, finally spoke up again. "It's not about whether I like it or not," he said, his tone surprisingly gentle. "It's about respect, Greg. You see, respect isn't just about saying the right words. It's about understanding the impact of what you say." The tension in the store was palpable. The crowd was torn. Some agreed with Greg, others with Morgan. But no one could deny that things were starting to get heated again. And once again, it was all revolving around one simple, hurtful comment that Jessica had made earlier. "I'm not asking for anyone to forgive me just because I said sorry," Jessica said, her voice shaky but filled with conviction. "But I will take responsibility for what I said, and I'm not going to hide behind excuses." Morgan gave her a slow nod, as if weighing her words. For a moment, the store fell into silence once more. Everyone was watching, waiting for Morgan to make his next move. Would he leave it here? Would he walk away and let this moment dissolve into the past? And then, unexpectedly, he spoke. "You're right," he said. "Owning up to something is the first step toward understanding." The room exhaled collectively. The tension eased, but only slightly. The situation was far from over. It was clear now that the entire town was divided. Some wanted to move on, while others felt the need to confront the issue head-on. As Morgan turned to leave, the teenage girl who had been starstruck earlier approached him, looking both embarrassed and thoughtful. "Mr. Freeman," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I'm really sorry, too. I didn't mean to make things worse. I got caught up in the moment." Morgan Freeman paused and turned to face her. For a brief second, their eyes met, and then Morgan simply smiled, though it was a knowing smile, one that conveyed understanding rather than anger. "We all get caught up sometimes," he said, his voice soft but firm. "The key is knowing when to stop and listen." And with that, he left the store, his grocery bag still in hand. But as he walked out of the door, the real consequences of the moment were just beginning to unfold. Would the town ever fully recover from this? Was this just the beginning of a much larger conversation? As the door swung closed behind Morgan Freeman, the tension in the store didn't dissipate. In fact, it seemed to intensify. People lingered, exchanging hushed whispers, glancing nervously at each other. Jessica stood by the counter, still trembling from the whirlwind of emotions she had just experienced. It was as if the entire room had been electrified by the clash of words and the weight of Morgan's wisdom. She had apologized. She had owned up to her mistake. But there was something about that lingering silence that made her feel like she wasn't done. The words of the stranger, Greg, still echoed in her mind, the anger and the accusation still fresh in the air. Greg Miller, the local businessman, had been so adamant that things couldn't just be swept under the rug. "We can't let people think it's okay to insult someone like Morgan Freeman," he had said. The words rattled through Jessica's mind like a broken record. Had she really caused that much harm? Had she hurt someone she didn't even know in ways she couldn't understand? But was Greg right? Was it possible to just let this go? Or was there more to it than she could see? Outside, the world moved on. The sound of the traffic, the laughter of children playing, the chatter of people walking down the street. It all felt so distant. Inside the store, however, it was as though time had frozen. The world was on pause, and everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for what came next. Jessica glanced around at the other customers. Some of them had left the store, while others remained, as if trying to decide whether to speak out or let the silence continue. It was clear that no one was going to leave this moment unscathed. A woman in her late 40s, with short cropped hair and a no-nonsense look on her face, stepped forward. She was one of the last to approach Jessica, but her presence was commanding. "You know, sweetie," she said, her voice firm but not unkind, "I think you've learned your lesson. It's clear you're sorry." Jessica opened her mouth to respond, but the woman raised a hand to stop her. "Don't get me wrong," she continued, "you made a mistake. But don't let anyone in this town make you feel like you're anything less than human for it." Jessica felt a small wave of relief. Maybe it wasn't about the apology. Maybe it was about the acceptance, the understanding. But before she could respond, Greg spoke again. "Well, that's just the thing, isn't it?" Greg Miller's voice was like a thorn in the air, jarring against the softness of the moment. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on Jessica's. "You can apologize all you want, but can you really take back what you said? Can you take back calling a man like Morgan Freeman an old fool in front of everyone?" Jessica flinched. He was right in a way. She had done more than just insult a celebrity. She had insulted someone who had spent his life fighting for justice, who had used his platform to speak out for what was right. I didn't mean it like that," she stammered, her voice cracking. She looked at the ground, unable to meet Greg's gaze. I just got frustrated." The woman who had spoken earlier shook her head. "You can't always excuse your actions just because you're frustrated, Greg. But let's not act like you're a saint either. We all have moments where we say the wrong thing, and I'm sure you've said your fair share of stupid stuff in your time." The crowd murmured in agreement, the weight of Greg's earlier words beginning to lose their power. Jessica had apologized. She had taken responsibility, and that had to count for something, right? But still, the uncertainty lingered in the air. Was this enough? Could they all just move on from this and pretend it never happened? Or was this just the beginning of something much bigger? As Jessica wiped a tear from her cheek, the bell above the door jingled again. Morgan Freeman had returned, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him was a reporter, a young woman with a microphone in hand, her camera crew standing at the ready. They had clearly been waiting for the right moment to arrive, and now it had come. Morgan Freeman turned toward Jessica and the others, raising a hand to silence the growing murmur in the room. "I didn't come back here to make a spectacle of this," he said, his voice calm, but filled with an undeniable gravity. "But there's something I need to make clear. This isn't about me. This is about all of us, as a community." He paused, allowing the words to sink in. "There are lessons to be learned from this. We can't just pretend like racism and disrespect are things of the past. They still exist. They show up in the words we say, the things we do, and the way we treat one another. And it's time we start talking about it." The room went quiet again, even quieter than before. This wasn't just a discussion about an insult anymore. This was a conversation about how far the world had come, and how much further it still needed to go. Jessica here made a mistake. She owns that mistake, and I respect that, Morgan continued, his voice steady. But we all have a role to play in making sure we do better. I want you all to think about that. The reporter stepped forward, raising her microphone. "Mr. Freeman, would you like to elaborate on your thoughts regarding the incident?" Morgan Freeman smiled slightly, then turned to Jessica. "I'm not here to point fingers. I'm here to help." And with that, everything changed. The small town had been forced to confront its issues in a way it never had before. And the story was far from over. But the biggest question on everyone's mind wasn't just about Jessica and her apology. It was about what came next. Would this single incident spark real change in the town, or would it fade away like so many others? The days following Morgan Freeman's visit to the store felt like a whirlwind. The quiet town of Brookfield, previously known for its sleepy, mundane atmosphere, was suddenly thrust into the national spotlight. News outlets picked up the story. Social media exploded with clips of Morgan's powerful words, as people from all walks of life weighed in on the event. For Jessica, the pressure was unbearable. She couldn't walk through the grocery store or go to the post office without hearing whispers. But it wasn't just the scrutiny she was worried about. It was the weight of what she had learned in such a short amount of time. She realized that this wasn't about her anymore. It was about everyone. It was about the kind of town Brookfield was, and the kind of town it could be. But there was still something gnawing at her. Despite the understanding from some of the townsfolk, the incident hadn't healed every wound. She could still feel the cold glares from certain faces in the crowd. It wasn't enough to just apologize. The deeper issue remained. Why had it taken an incident like this for the town to finally talk about race, respect, and accountability? Jessica had spent hours talking to her parents, trying to figure out how she could help the town heal. Her mother, always the practical one, suggested starting a town-wide discussion. Maybe we could have a meeting or something where everyone can speak freely about what happened, she said, trying to offer a solution. But Jessica wasn't sure it would be that simple. Greg Miller, who had been so vocal about the issue from the start, kept his distance in the days following the incident. He had been the one to demand an apology, to call out Jessica's behavior, and to pressure the town to confront the bigger issues at play. Now he was strangely quiet. Some speculated that he had gotten more than he bargained for with all the media attention, but Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She needed to talk to him. It was a cool Friday evening when Jessica finally found herself walking down Main Street, headed toward the diner. She wasn't planning on running into anyone, but sure enough, as soon as she stepped inside, there he was, Greg Miller, sitting at a booth near the back, his face shadowed by the dim light above. "Greg," she said, her voice tentative. She had rehearsed what she would say in her mind, but now that the moment had arrived, the words seemed to evade her. Greg looked up, his expression unreadable. "Jessica," he said simply. "Come sit down." She hesitated for a moment, but then slid into the booth opposite him. The diner was quiet tonight, with only a few patrons scattered around. The smell of coffee and grilled cheese sandwiches filled the air, but it was a far cry from the tension in Jessica's chest. "What's going on, Greg?" she asked. "You've been awfully quiet lately." Greg sighed deeply, pushing his plate aside. "I've been thinking about it a lot. About everything. I know I came off pretty strong in the beginning, and I stand by what I said. But I don't know, Jessica. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing anymore." She frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "I thought calling it out would fix things. But I've realized now that it's bigger than one mistake. Bigger than what happened in the store," he explained, running a hand through his hair. "It's a pattern, a habit, the way people think. And I'm starting to wonder if pushing everyone into this right or wrong mentality is actually helping. I'm not sure anymore." Jessica was stunned. She had always thought of Greg as the one who was so sure of his position. He was the one who had drawn the line and demanded an apology. But now he was questioning everything. "So, what now?" she asked, her voice small. "Do we just forget it?" No, we don't forget," Greg said quickly. "But we need to change the way we're handling it. We need to give people space to learn, to grow. I've been so focused on calling people out that I haven't been thinking about how we can move forward together. I want to be part of that solution, Jessica. But I don't know how to fix this, not all at once." Jessica sat back, absorbing his words. She wasn't sure she agreed with him completely, but she understood what he was saying. Maybe it was time to shift the conversation from blame to healing. Maybe it was time to take the conversation to the people who needed it most. The bell above the diner door jingled, and a familiar face stepped inside, Megan, the reporter who had been with Morgan Freeman when he came back to the store. She looked around for a moment before spotting them and making her way over. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice light and friendly. Jessica nodded, her stomach in knots. She didn't know if this was a good or bad thing, but she was too curious to turn her away. "I was hoping to talk to both of you about something," Megan said, sitting down without waiting for an invitation. "You've both been part of the story, right? And this town has become ground zero for an important conversation. People are watching. So, what happens next?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, none of them spoke. It was as if Megan had asked the very thing they had all been afraid to admit. What had happened next? How could they move beyond this moment, beyond the fallout of one woman's mistake, and build something better. But before any of them could answer, the door opened again, and a familiar voice rang out from the doorway. "We're going to make sure this doesn't end with just words." "It can't." It was Morgan Freeman. The whole diner seemed to freeze in that instant. Morgan Freeman, standing at the door with a calm but unmistakable intensity, was the last person anyone expected to see. His presence had a way of silencing a room. Everyone knew who he was, but more importantly, they knew what he represented. Morgan wasn't just an actor. He was a symbol of wisdom, dignity, and the voice of reason in a world that often lacked both. Jessica, Greg, and Megan exchanged glances, each of them stunned. Jessica, still processing the conversation she had just shared with Greg, felt a sudden rush of emotions. Was this really happening? Had Morgan Freeman come back for them? For Brookfield? Morgan stepped into the booth, his gait slow but steady, his eyes scanning the room before resting on Jessica and Greg. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," he said with a slight smile. His voice, always so smooth and commanding, held a warmth that made the air feel a little less heavy. "Not at all," Jessica said, trying to regain her composure. "What brings you back here?" Morgan took a seat, his back straight, but his demeanor relaxed. "Well, I've been thinking a lot about what happened, too. I think the town has done something important, but there's a lot more work ahead of us." He turned to Greg and Megan, then back to Jessica. "This isn't something you can just fix overnight. It's a process." Greg, still deep in thought, leaned forward. "We've been talking about it," he said slowly. "And you're right. It's not enough to just call people out. We need to build understanding, not just awareness." Morgan nodded. "Exactly. It's easy to see an issue and point fingers. But real change comes when we start talking, truly talking about why we do the things we do and how we can be better." Jessica sat in silence, feeling a mixture of gratitude and awe. She had seen Morgan Freeman on television, had heard his voice narrating some of the most profound documentaries and movies in the world. But to hear him speak here, in her small town, about something so personal made her feel like they were part of something much larger, something important. "So," Megan began, her pen already out, "how do we take this conversation beyond here? The town is watching. People are talking. We can't let this fade into the background." Morgan smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he already knew the answer. "It's time to put the conversation into action. We start by making sure that this is a space where everyone feels safe to talk, to listen, and to learn. We don't let this be just another moment that fades into the background. We make it part of who we are." Greg's eyes lit up as if he had just had an epiphany. "A community forum," he said, the words coming out quickly. "Something regular, where everyone can come together, share their thoughts, and learn from each other. We could invite speakers, hold workshops, and make sure that this town isn't just talking about change, we're living it." Morgan nodded in approval. "That's a great start. But remember, it's not just about talking. It's about listening, too. It's about making sure that people's voices are heard, even when they're uncomfortable or hard to hear." Jessica couldn't believe what she was hearing. In her wildest dreams, she hadn't expected Morgan Freeman to help shape the future of her town. But here he was, guiding them towards something that could really make a difference. She looked at Greg, and for the first time in days, she felt like they were on the same page. "So, we bring everyone in," she said, her voice growing stronger. "We listen, we learn, and we do better. No more pretending. No more silence." "Exactly," Greg said, a little more confidently. "It's time to create a culture of accountability. One where people aren't afraid to ask questions, to admit when they're wrong, and to grow from it. We can't just sweep this under the rug." The conversation went on for hours. As the evening turned into night, the diner filled with more and more people from the town. Word had spread quickly that Morgan Freeman was in town, and they all wanted to hear what he had to say. But what was most striking about the evening wasn't just his words. It was the way the town began to shift. People who had once been silent now spoke up. They shared their stories, their struggles, and their hopes for a better future. Jessica felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, but also a sense of purpose. The mistake she had made was not one that could be erased, but it had set something in motion. Maybe this was the start of something new for Brookfield. Maybe this was the moment when the town could look beyond its flaws and begin to heal. As the night drew to a close, Morgan stood up to leave. He turned to Jessica and Greg, his eyes twinkling with something like approval. "I'm proud of you both," he said, his voice softer now. "But remember, this isn't over. This is just the beginning. Keep pushing for change and don't be afraid to face the tough conversations. It's the only way forward." With that, he turned to leave. The door jingled softly behind him as he walked out into the cool night, leaving behind a town that was forever changed. Greg and Jessica sat in silence for a moment, each of them feeling the weight of the evening's events. Then, without speaking, they stood up and walked toward the door. "Let's get started," Greg said, his voice determined. Jessica nodded. "Let's do this." And with that, Brookfield began its journey toward true change.